Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the MarketsWiki education history-focused video series and more.
LIFFE, where I became what's known as a PID observer. And so that was the people that would actually monitor trading in the pit and report the prices and act as a policeman, as it were. So the fascinating thing, I suppose, that was June 87. Come October 87, of course, we had Black Monday and the crash. And one of the benefits that we had at LIFFE at the time was we did have Eurodollars and Treasury futures also on the floor. So I was actually observing in the Eurodollars and Treasuries that afternoon because US markets had hit limit up. We were still open in London because we didn't have any limits. So we continued to trade and had a very good afternoon that afternoon. And I think the Chicago exchanges finally then kind of got the point that they had to open at 7:20 in the morning rather than 8 o'clock, because LIFFE was obviously getting business still from that area. Towards the end of 87, there was then a realization that the main products on the market were the gilt futures and short sterling. So as we came into 1988, then there was a need for obviously new products on the exchange. And at the end of 88 was the introduction of German Government Bond futures, which was the Bund. And I suppose nobody really recognized how big a contract that was going to be, because we weren't aware of the fact that we had German unification on the horizon, which came in 1990. And with the introduction of the unification and the swapping of the Ostmark for the Deutschmark on a one-to-one basis, you had the introduction of a huge amount of new German government bond issuance, which obviously fueled a lot more of the business that was likely to come into the Bund futures market then. When they were introduced, of course, DTB hadn't actually started at that point. So therefore, there was a receptive market for futures anyway. And when it came to the introduction of DTB, which would have been around 1990, they were originally focused on the DAX futures product and 14 equity options. So you didn't actually see the introduction of a Bund futures product until later in 91. After unification, the volumes at LIFFE really started to pick up, given the amount of debt that was being issued. And that prompted, I suppose, DTB to then consider bringing their own product in quicker. And they brought their product in 91, by which stage, of course, LIFFE already had the first mover advantage. What I suppose where DTB had a benefit that they wouldn't normally have in any new product that's being brought in was that the German banks actually agreed in the early days to give market maker support, and even more crucially, volume support towards actually the DTB product. So if you're then looking into 92, 93, you're already seeing a situation whereby actually the DTB product on the Bunds did manage to get to 25% market share, so 25 to 30. Was kind of the range that was there constantly for a given period of time, just because there was actually that introduction of liquidity and support from certain market participants. If you look at most of the European exchanges that were actually formed, it was all in the early 90s mainly. The SOFEX market in Switzerland and the OM market in Scandinavia had actually opened up at the end of the 80s. But they were predominantly equity-based markets. And then you also had the French market was open already, with a floor-based market as well, particularly for the LATs. Even they started a negotiation with Globex in the early 90s to look for ways in which they could actually extend their own electronic trading capability. Across continental Europe, the way to go was really basically you couldn't start a new floor-based market. The idea was to start an electronic exchange. Also, DTB maybe stole a march on LIFFE. LIFFE were very focused on introducing first all the 10-year products. So they'd introduced the BTP, which is the Italian government bonds. We had a go at the Spanish government bond market as well. And then there were a number of short-term interest rate futures products. So after the Euromark, you also had Euro Lira, you had Euro Swiss. So what they missed was actually going to the 5-year area until later on. So LIFFE didn't introduce their bubble contract until 93. So in a sense, DTB had a bit of an advantage there that they'd actually been trading the Bund and the bubble contracts, so 10 and 5-year, alongside each other already for a period of time. The next major step, I suppose, towards more electronification of the market was the introduction of an investment services directive, which allowed European exchanges to actually put their screens into other countries. So this had already happened in both France and Holland prior to the introduction of the investment services directive itself. But then the other catalyst was from 96, then DTB had the opportunity to put their screens into the UK. And in the same year, they'd actually introduced them into the US under the CFTC no action letter. So instead of just having one floor-based market, you now had the ability for many different market participants across the globe to potentially participate into the DTB product. When I first got over in 95, the initial things that we were looking at was the expansion of the product across various different markets. So we knew that we'd be able to put screens into the UK. Plus, because of me being more a product guy as well as business development, I'd started looking at the options first to see whether we could do anything to change the option products there. But then I suppose from 96 through to 98, although I was living in Frankfurt, I was probably in London every other week and actually working on the basis that where were the Achilles heels that we could start to work on that would actually benefit the Bund contract. We already had, as I mentioned, the benefit of having the bubble alongside the Bund to be able to trade the spread. My next piece then really was looking at the introduction of the Schatz, which is the 2-year contract. And in introducing that, of course, we had the curve there. But what was a key thing really already at that point was while we were looking at introducing that product towards the end of 97, early 98, already we're looking forward, I suppose, to the fact that there was the introduction of the euro coming in on the 1st of January, 99. So what you found then was there was a huge amount of transactions going on that were looking at the conversion of the spread between Italian, French, and Spanish government bonds in particular versus the Bund. So, of course, the Bund was the constant against all of those other markets. So, therefore, that contributed to a huge increase in volume on the Bund from that perspective. But it was also a move towards the fact that those contracts were going to die and the Bund was going to be the focal point going further forward from there. So by building out the curve and having the whole curve there, you now were looking at the German government bond as being the focal point for Europe, features associated with them actually being the focal point of all liquidity. So that was the key area that we were effectively sort of trying to build already from that point of view. Eurex was introduced end of 98. So to a large extent, kind of the Bund battle was done by then. And I suppose the merger with Sofex wasn't really going to give us too much from an interest rate perspective. Swiss government bond futures is not the most exciting thing to to follow. We certainly got some more liquidity on the index and equity option side. We'd spoken to the guys at Matif in Paris, and for various different reasons, that didn't quite happen during that timeframe. And I think that was largely because there was a view that they thought French government bond futures would be maintained post-Euro, whereas we were of the opinion that obviously that was all going to converge onto the Bund futures product. As you know, John, I think amongst all the exchanges, while there's fierce competition that goes on, there's actually a good friendship that's still there as well. There was probably a few question marks around whether I should be walking down dark alleyways at night in the City of London if there was some floor traders around. Maybe that was more of an issue. Yeah, obviously, my grounding was definitely what I learnt initially was definitely at LIFFE, and people like John Foyle, Nick Carew-Hunt were certainly sort of some of the mentors that I'd had in the early days there. So we always kept a civil sort of friendship, and still have done sort of over the years, even after that. So I think that's just a reality. It's to me, it's always been. It's a bit like a trader deciding that he's going to move from one bank to another. At the end of the day, you want to win as much market share as you can when you move to your new organization. And you're going to do whatever you can that's best for yourself. So ultimately, that was similar, from my perspective. We got to a point towards the end of 97 where gradually the DTB market share had been moving up. And it was towards the end of 97 that we got above the 50% market share. And I suppose there you've got to look at it from the point of view that in one sense, DTB was completely focused on that particular battle. So that was all consuming from their side. On the flip side, you had LIFFE being a hugely successful organization, but perhaps there was a bit of complacency that had set in. And certainly, as I said, one of the reasons for me moving on was a view that perhaps they were going to milk what they had, as opposed to actually a huge amount of new innovation. Fortunately, I suppose for DTB, the approach that LIFFE took was to try and add more technology with handheld devices and whatever to the pit to prolong actually open outcry trading, as opposed to recognizing that it wasn't going that way. It was actually going to go fully electronic. But also it was a member organization. So of course you had something of a conflict of interest, because a lot of the people that were doing very well from floor trading were sitting on the board as well. So therefore, there must have been some interesting conversations, obviously, at board meetings around the management at LIFFE, perhaps pushing one thing and floor traders and members pushing something else. But one of the things, as I was in London so much at the time, that struck me was that I'd be perhaps in a bar in London chatting to guys about, I missed X, Y, or Z this week because they weren't in town, only to go back to Frankfurt to find out that actually the guys who were making the impassioned pleas at the LIFFE board were actually in Frankfurt becoming DTB members at the same point in time. So they were actually covering both sides of the bet, as it were. I think from that perspective, it was probably a very difficult sort of situation for the LIFFE management at that point to try and push things one way or another. Once we'd actually got to that 52%, coming towards the end of 97, when we went into the roll at the end of that year, effectively what happened was it just took two more rolls in March and June of 98, and everything was done. Once it got to that 50%, it really did just sort of tip over, and the market moved in that direction. At that point, I think it really was the fact that Euro was very much on the horizon then. Everybody was preparing for it already. So you could actually see that there was that convergence of business coming together. And the other benefit that DTB really had at that point was by winning the market share there, not only were they winning effectively the fixed income futures business going into Europe, but it also gave us the opportunity to look at the index futures side and introduce the Eurostoxx 50 futures at that point in time. So we actually had the credibility to be able to go out to market and say, here we are now as the biggest, actually at that point in time, at the end of 98, not just being the biggest exchange in Europe, we overtook Board of Trade at that point in time as well. And so therefore the largest exchange in the world. And off the back of that, introducing a Eurostoxx index future. Again, nobody was to know how successful that was going to be, but it gave us that credibility to be able to go out to the marketplace, I think, and introduce that. And as we've seen since, Eurostoxx now is far and away the biggest product on Eurex, even above, probably even if you add Bund Bubble Schatz together. When LIFFE was most successful in the early days, it was with quite a small team to begin with. It didn't become kind of bloated until probably towards the end of the 90s, when it actually had become a lot more successful, but didn't really have the new volumes that were going to work with that. When I moved over to Frankfurt mid-90s, there was less than 100 people working for DTB. So it was kind of going back to the early LIFFE days where it was similar when I joined. You've really got everybody kind of pulling together. Everybody knows each other. Andreas would have Friday afternoon drinks. Instead of having a big open plan office, it was everybody had small little cubicles that they were in. From that perspective, it was encouraging to see kind of everybody coming together on a Friday afternoon. I think one of the things that I really noticed there was that people tended to come in on time, leave on time, have their 1 hour or whatever for lunch. But generally speaking, it was just work for the whole of the day in between. So although to me it seemed like actually quite a relaxed environment in comparison to a London-based sort of perspective, but they tended to be very focused on doing what they had to do within that time frame. And as I said, having just a small team worked very well. One of the key things actually that I was doing was going to Chicago quite a lot because the ACE Alliance was set up between Eurex and CBOT. Again, because the platform that they had was obviously very much suited towards a fixed income franchise. Board of Trade viewed that, I suppose, as being kind of the platform of choice. And that's the platform that they would use as their ability to kind of move further forward. Part of that was working with people like Fred Greed, Cliff Lewis, with a view to even looking at pricing. We had a team that was actually over from Frankfurt, myself over at the same time, working with them to discuss how we could look at pricing in a new electronic trading environment, and how we'd push further forward from there. Of course, at that point in time, LIFFE had managed to resurrect themselves, as it were, with LIFFE Connect. And for sure, the LIFFE Connect platform, one, was a new platform. Two, was specifically set up to cover the short end. So to effectively be able to have cross-market spreads. That was an issue with the Eurex system. They never quite managed to get to a point where with the Euribor that they could actually do that. And I think you had a situation then from that 99-2000 sort of period going through where CBOT then got to a point where they were of the opinion, do we stick with what was an aging kind of platform from the Eurex side, or do they think about switching to LIFFE Connect? The CBOT management decided to drop the DTB platform or the Eurex platform and actually take on LIFFE Connect instead as their platform of choice. The Board of Trade were concerned that Eurex could come in and actually move business. I think at that point it was the view that the Eurex platform was the right platform for a fixed income franchise as opposed to a short-term interest rate franchise. So, CME, of course, with Globex, had a very different approach that was more Life Connect-like, as we'd seen with some of the complacency, perhaps, with the Life management team back in the 90s. You now had a change of the guard because come 2000, Jörg Franke decided that he was going to retire. Andreas Preuss wasn't made CEO at that point in time. You brought in somebody who was a relative outsider to the futures world. So Rudi Ferscher came in to be CEO of Eurex, and that, I think, just brought a whole different dynamic. Whereas Franke and Preuss had a very good relationship, I think, with Greed and Cliff Lewis, etc. Maybe that dynamic that came through then from that side was different. I'm sure that if there'd been more work put into it, there could have been ways of finding that the Eurex platform could have been maintained. But once the decision, I think, was made by Board of Trade to switch to Life Connect, then the view was that it was kind of open season, and therefore that gave Eurex the opportunity to go in and launch treasury products under Eurex US. Here was an opportunity to replicate what had happened with the Bund, and actually not necessarily win 100% market share, but certainly take a good market share with respect to treasury products. Interestingly, there were a few of us that were looking at the various markets in the US at that point in time. Somebody you may remember, John Harding, who'd been at the Board of Trade for a number of years, was actually now consulting for Eurex, and Randolph Roth, who was working in Chicago for Eurex at the time. I was working with the two of them, and we'd actually written a paper to the board suggesting that we actually should have looked at the NYMEX market, and that we should have attempted to look at WTI and what was going on there, rather than trying to compete on the Chicago side. Because in our opinion, we figured that the guys in Chicago would view any competition as being very similar to what happened with the Bund, therefore would immediately respond much more proactively than what had happened in the Life market days. So therefore, perhaps we'd have much more opportunity by going for a different marketplace that maybe didn't feel as threatened in that sense. But obviously the decision was made to go with the approach for the Eurex US and Treasuries. And then you had the lobbying that obviously went on from the Chicago exchanges side, which meant that actually getting approval to start the exchange in the US, CFTC approval, didn't come until a long period of time afterwards. So we'd been ready to go for a long period. The members who'd signed up had kind of been sitting there with a lot of their kit where they'd done the testing, but it was then in mothballs until we kind of got the green light. And then we got the approval, I seem to remember, on the Thursday, and the view was to go live immediately on the Sunday night. Although in theory, all of the members had tested, then to say you're going live on Sunday night, basically, I think was a bridge too far. And we should have waited to try and corral a certain amount of liquidity together immediately, because certainly the banks weren't ready to switch on the Sunday night. So what you then found was that you had a bunch of proprietary trading firms who were effectively mirroring the Board of Trade market with a two-way market. Again, perhaps because of the experience of the Bund, you then had some other proprietary trading groups who recognized that and were effectively cleaning through the book on Eurex US, so that the guys didn't have the opportunity to just be able to lean against the Board of Trade market. And that may also have had something to do with Harris Brumfield again, maybe even more his brother. So on that particular occasion, people recognized what had happened first time round, were more prepared for the whole thing. Board of Trade cut their fees immediately once the announcement was made that Eurex US was going live. So I think from that perspective, there was none of the catalysts that were there in Europe with respect to electronic trading just coming in, with the Investment Services Directive, with new liquidity coming from the US, with the introduction of the euro, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, the fact that it was a German product as well, and the support that came from the German banks, none of that was obviously there for Eurex US, so therefore you couldn't replicate it in the same way. Ultimately, the demise of the Board of Trade was still in some ways brought about by Eurex US, because with the Board of Trade Clearing Corporation allowing Eurex US to use that as their clearing corp, Board of Trade decided to move their open interest over to CME Clearinghouse. And in a sense, that was perhaps the beginning of the end for the Board of Trade, because once the open interest had moved into CME, then obviously CME had the upper hand, and that probably led to the point where CME and CBOT came together.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our MarketsWiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.